Well, hi everyone. This is Dr. Back again. And this week we get a chance to meet virtually. So I won't be there with you in person, but I will continue to be here and try to give you perspective on this topic. So this week we're talking about the qualitative methods. So just to connect the dots, last week we were talking about the quantitative methods, and one of the things that we started talking about, actually for the last couple of weeks, we started to talk about those quantitative methodologies that we can use to collect data. We were talking about the questions that we can ask, the type of questions, the tools that we can use to send the surveys, etc. So this week we are switching gears, and instead of talking about quantitative data, so things that will give us numbers so we can do mathematical or statistical calculations, this time we're going to talk about the qualitative methodology, which is going to take us on a different path. In a sense, we're still collecting data. This time you're going to hear me talk about information, because you're actually hearing information from people rather than just getting numbers. So, talking about the advantages and disadvantages of the methodology for qualitative, we have three. Technically, we have three. There are a couple of subgroups. So we have the interviews, we have the focus groups, and we have the surveys. Of course, in the past, we have talked about observations as well. So in a focus group and in an interview, we do conduct observations as well. But for the purposes of the qualitative data, we are going to definitely nix out the surveys. So for this week, let's talk about the interviews and the focus groups only. So the interviews, the advantages, definitely you get rich data. You get flexibility in terms of what people are going to tell you. The interviewers' availability is definitely something that is an advantage, because you're there, you can collect data on the spot. The interviewer, or having a person there too, ensures cooperation. So the interviewer can explain to the interviewee why the questions and what is the answer going to help inform. So there is more willingness for the interviewee to respond. There is also rapport and the confidence building. So you have somebody who is reassuring. That's why the personality of the interviewer has to be the people person. You, as I mentioned before, you can use the interviews and get that data, but you have to be careful, because at some point that data is going to be potentially biased, which takes us to the drawbacks. So if you see there, the first bullet actually talks about the consumption of resources. You are actually using people's times, not just the respondents taking time to respond to the questions on a survey, but you're also having an interviewer meet with people. You have to prepare, you have to set a room. Sometimes if you don't have a room in your building or in your office, you do have to rent one, or you would have to invite somebody to a coffee in order to do the interview. So there is always a cost to it. So the resource can be either financial or human capital or otherwise. So there is that consumption. The accessibility is another thing. What if the people that you need to interview are not available? What if they work third shift? Chances are they're going to be asleep during the interviewer daytime. So that could be a challenge of accessibility. As I mentioned, the potential bias, because the person can give you their opinion, but that does not necessarily make it factual. So that's where you have to talk about, or you have to be able to differentiate between the objective data and the subjective data. Now, I'm not saying you have to ditch the subjective data. You definitely are going to need it. That's the whole purpose of getting a qualitative analysis. But you have to treat it carefully, and you have to make sure when you are analyzing or when you're sending for analysis, the people that are going to analyze that qualitative data understand the potential of the bias, and they can discern between objective and subjective information. So for example, just to finish this piece, if the person that is analyzing the information can say that the interviews were to find out complaints from employees of a certain company, you know that everybody is, by the mere principle of complaints, everything is going to be negative. So the person that is analyzing this will have to have at least some type of awareness as to what are some potential issues: scheduling, lunch breaks, vending machines, punching machines for the timesheet check-in, etc. So they have to have an ability to understand what is a potential challenge and what could present a complaint. Otherwise, they would be pretty much diving in the dark. They wouldn't have an idea what is a bias and what is not, what is objective and what is subjective. Moving on, the poor reliability. When you hear somebody speak, you're hearing them on the spot. So you have to remember that sometimes the mindset of the respondents may be tainted. And that's a temporary thing. So you have to be careful. So the reliability is not that strong. And then also, it doesn't yield as many big opportunities to meet with people. So remember when I was talking about resource consumption? The more people you want to interview, the less time you're going to have available, the more interviewers you're going to need. And if you don't have them, then that's a challenge. As far as for the focus groups, it still provides that rich data as far as the advantages, similar to the interview. The difference is the person who is going to navigate through this focus group and is going to guide a number of people through it is that they're going to need major skills to manage the group, give the opportunity for somebody to speak, and they know how to redirect and send the time to another person. Okay. Also, another advantage of the focus groups is that it gives you great perspectives and personal viewpoints, and actually you get to hear multiple people at the same time. Well, not at the same time, but during the same event, which gives you a plethora of viewpoints. And so if you capture those, you can definitely correlate them later or compare them and contrast them. So that's fantastic, right? Now, as far as the drawbacks, poor choice of sensitive topics is one of the big drawbacks, because in a focus group you cannot talk about something that is very sensitive. I can say one of the things this time around that is very difficult to navigate a conversation with multiple people, because you run the risk of having very polarizing viewpoints, is the political environment currently. So that's definitely a focus group I would not recommend for a rookie to try to manage. Fortunately, nobody has a topic related to politics, nor would I probably accept it for the purpose of the class, because that could get very heated very quickly. And then also another drawbacks is that by having a focus group, by definition, you're going to have more than one person. That is going to render smaller sample size. So you're going to have fewer people into the focus groups. For example, and just to give you a comparison, you can have 4 interviewees in a morning, and they will take you X number of minutes each one. So from 8:30 to 12 or 9 to 12. As far as focus groups, you can have 4 or 5. I wouldn't recommend going more than 6 or 8. That's pushing it a little bit. If you get to 10, you're going to have to increase the number of minutes that you're going to allow for that big group to respond. So that means still fewer people, and you have consumed still a big number of minutes, or a large number of minutes. So say 2 hours for a focus group. And then when you go to the next focus group, you're going to have only X number of people, also for an hour or 2 or at the most. So you don't want to run too many focus groups, because that is consuming your resources, and you won't have the ability to really get rich data at that point. So you have to manage that amount of people that are going to be in the focus group. As far as the types of interviews, so let's focus on the interviews. So from here on out, we're going to focus on the interview this week. And then later we're going to dive into the focus groups, which is really not that different. But the bigger things are the interviews that take place in person, Those are usually the best because you have direct eye contact, you are within distance, you are clear, there is no misinterpretation of words, pronunciation, etc. And then there's also the phone interviews, and then there's the computer-based interviews, believe it or not. And this has probably been a practice that has been forgotten in the last 10 years. But there was a time where we used to have interviews in a computer. So you would sit in front of a computer, and just like a survey, a question would come up, and then you would just type your essay as a part of the answer. And then that would go into a database, and then somebody else would pull it up and do an analysis. That is becoming a little bit less of a practice, although some companies still do it. But let's go back to the in-person interviews, and let's talk about the advantages. You can observe all the mannerisms, the verbal and the non-verbal communication that your interviewee is having. You can detect when the interviewee is getting nervous, anxious, frustrated, closed, mad, etc. And so you can redirect, you can reassure them, you can provide them context without running the risk of turning them off. So that's a huge advantage. Another advantage of the phone interviews is easy access. You don't have to travel. You don't have to find a location where to interview somebody. You don't have to buy them coffee. You just pick up the phone, dial, pray that they answer the phone. If they answer and they agree to take the survey, you are in business. And so that allows you to conserve resources because one person can knock out quite a few interviews via phone. But the problem is it becomes a little bit impersonal, and it's you lose the nonverbal communication. So you see the drawbacks there. And then from the computer-based interview style, if you include video, it does allow for the nonverbal communication. So I'm thinking nowadays Skype, that's probably the most tool of choice, or FaceTime for those of you who are Apple phone owners. And it does allow you to save the resources, so it's not as costly and you don't have to have that many people. But as far as the drawbacks, it requires that technology, which sometimes can be expensive, and the comfort. So what if your interviewer is great at putting people at ease, but is not so comfortable handling the technology? Or today's is the rainy day that prevents the video to come up, and so you have to deal with that. So those are the things to consider when you're talking about the types of interviews. Now let's talk about the phases of interviews. Just in the past, we also talked about the phases of surveys. Now we're going to talk about the phases of the interviews. And I did something similar. So you have to prepare the interviews. So for that preparation of the interviews, we still have to decide what is it that we're going to measure. What is that you're going after? Brainstorm and decide what information or data. See, here's where that change of language. So in the quantitative methods, we specifically talk about data. But in the qualitative, it could be data or it could be information. But both of them are exchangeably usable and permitted. So what is that information bit that you are going to find helpful and that you're going to analyze to determine that gap? And so sometimes it can be just a couple of things, which makes it easy, makes it for a short interview. But you definitely have to figure that out. You also use this preparation time to figure out, okay, so do you need to ask questions to define the current state? Do you need to ask questions to define the future state? Or do you need to prepare statements that could be formulated as a question, but the answers by the interviewee will help you validate a gap that you already have seen. So that is the preparation. Then we move into the design of the interview. When we are designing an interview, and I'm sorry I say phases of a survey preparation there, but it's really an interview. We definitely want to know who and how many respondents we are going to interview. So this gets into the resources, right? We need to plan ahead. We need to make a schedule. We need to figure out where, location, and if we're going to buy anything, coffee, donuts, croissants, etc., we need to make an allocation for that and a time, make a provision for it. And then the most important things in the design of the interview. So this is really important in the framework. We need to formulate the hypothesis that we are going to test with this qualitative analysis or qualitative research. What you believe is currently the situation based on the information that you initially got from talking to someone or the records that you reviewed or what somebody told you, hey, we need your services here. Okay, so based on what you heard, this sounds like is what needs to happen, or this sounds like what the problem is. That's the hypothesis. And then you also need to formulate your proposition. So, what is it that you believe it is based on your opinion and observation? So, here's where we get into that. Oh, I believe these people are going to need training. Well, that is, before we find facts, an assumption. That is going to be the proposition we can make. So, depending on how we phrase it, it can sound like an assumption or it can be the proposition. So, as a matter of fact, if I were preparing a qualitative analysis or design, I would definitely say my proposition is that this group or this team is going to need longitudinal training. And so that's my proposition, which means when I collect the data, when I have interviewed everybody and I'm coding the responses, etc., I'll be able to test whether my proposition or the hypothesis test correctly. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. So next we have the point where you develop your questions. And similar to the survey, we want to pay attention to the language. And we want to make sure not to use negative language or language that will provoke negative responses or tacit responses. So by that I mean if we ask the question in such an elaborate way during the interview that basically contains a potential response within the question, then you can get a nod or you can get silence or you can get just a look. But that is not necessarily a response, and that's why I'm saying tacit, because it's not present. And we have to be careful, because if you're recording the interview so that you can code it later and interpret it and analyze it, and you're just voice recording and somebody nods and that's all they do, how do you capture that when you're listening back to the notes? You can't. So that's why I'm saying it's a tacit response, because it's not there. So you have to be careful and you have to provoke the interviewer, the interviewee, to provide an answer, somewhat of an answer. You have to make sure that your question is non-threatening, because the moment it becomes threatened, the interviewee is he or she is going to withdraw, and they are going to stop responding, and they are not going to give you what you need. So you have to be careful developing those questions. Now let's talk a little bit about the analysis part. So this is the next step. Of course, when we're preparing the questions, we need to figure out what is it that we're going to code for. So always we're going to need to look for themes. What are people talking the most about? So for those of you who are doing research around customers, the customer base, themes can be, how do people know about the business? How do people perceive the business? How are people satisfied with the business? So right there we have three different themes. One is the awareness via commercials, the other one is the perception, and the other one is the satisfaction. So you have to find those themes. You find them because people are going to talk to you, and so that's the hard labor of qualitative analysis. You have to read everything they say or listen to everything they say. Find those themes and then code them. You're going to have to categorize them, put them in a database, count them, so you end up doing the tallying of it. Same thing for words. You have to find those words that they say. If a lot of people are using the same word to describe something, and it is a problem, then that gives you a leeway to dive deeper into what it is, whether it's a word or a term or an acronym. Also, you need to pay attention to the new information. So during the analysis of qualitative data, we need to hear or read what are some of those new data points. What is it that people are talking about, the trends, the new words, the new definitions, things that you didn't hear when you were talking to your client, and then all of a sudden, and you didn't see in the records, and then all of a sudden you are hearing them. So for example, one thing that I could tell you is, imagine that you were at Disney World, and you see always a cast member in costume. So that's great, right? But if one day, by accident, you happen to see a cast member without the head of the costume, that would throw you off, wouldn't it? But that would make you wonder, what's going on? Because I don't know if you knew this, but at Disney, one of the rules of thumb and what keeps the magic contained is that no one that works at that park who is a character, who plays the role of a character, can wear half of the character's costume in public. So they have secret entrances and passages, etc., that if there is a wardrobe malfunction or they have a problem, they can hide before they take the costume off. So that could tip you off. Same thing for an interview. If you are hearing new things, people are complaining about something that you didn't even know, that's important. You probably want to look into it, right? And also the frequency of the comments or the themes. How often are you hearing this from the different interviews? If you're interviewing 5 people and you hear this 7 times, well, so obviously somebody's really animate about it and they said it quite a few times, but definitely that's something to pay attention to. And then also think about the correlation that exists between the theoretical framework, as in, if you're talking about customer service, there is a theoretical framework around customer service, and you can compare that and figure out if there is correlation with what the model says and what information from the respondents you are gathering. And if there is correlation, then that's a good thing. If there is no correlation, then that's also a good thing, because then that prompts you to ask more and find out more. So that's the whole idea of analyzing the qualitative data. Now, as far as question types, similar to what we did for the surveys, there are good types and not so good ones. So the good type of questions to use in an interview are questions that will prompt an opinion, questions that will prompt context, questions that will prompt understanding. When people say, oh, I understand that we need to produce 10 widgets an hour. Okay, good. But, and then they go on their explanation why they can't do it. And that's exactly what we want to get at, right? They are missing tools, they are getting a lot of interruptions, they are not getting the raw material they need, etc. So that's exactly what we're going after. And then also questions of personal matter. The problem with these questions, in an interview setting, that's acceptable, but you have to be very, very careful, because you have to provide the interviewee with context. Why are you asking that personal matter question? We cannot, and definitely there are some boundaries you cannot cross. We wouldn't ask people for PHI or the personal health information. We would not ask people, what medications are you taking, unless it is a qualitative research from a doctor's office where the respondent is a client or is a patient. That would maybe be okay, but there are still regulations to be careful with. So anyway, so those are the good types of questions. Be careful on the personal matter ones. And then the not so good questions are those threatening questions, pointed questions, questions that make the respondent feel like the light is being shone on them. Accusatory questions. I'm thinking always of the attorney movies that always say, did you or did you not present this information on Tuesday the 7th at 7 o'clock? That's very accusatory, so we have to be careful with that tonality. Okay, once we have the questions, then we define that protocol. So let's get back to that. So as far as the protocol, we need to explain the purpose of the interview. What are we trying to get? Share the amount of time that the person will need to allocate for the interview. So similar to the survey, we need to tell people how much time are they going to be using. How much time do they need to allocate? How much time are they going to be away from work or from their duties? Indicate the type of interview, whether it's going to be in person, phone, computer. The person, believe it or not, there was a time when if you told them, well, the interview is going to take place via computer, they would say, no, I don't think so, even though they had already said yes, they were going to do it. But it could be multiple reasons. They don't have access to a computer, they don't feel comfortable talking to a computer, etc. So they don't have connectivity, so that could be. So that's how you define the protocol. So that's what I call the protocol. How are you going to carry out the interview? Then the cover letter or email. We still need to do that, and so most often than not, it's usually an email. But there are times when we still are going to get a letter and we're going to say you are cordially invited to participate in a study of XYZ to take place on X date at X time at X location. And we are going to interview you for 20 minutes. And the interviewer will be Matt Lauer and etc. 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 So that's exactly what we need to begin including. So, to summarize, we need to introduce ourselves, introduce the team, explain the interview process, what will happen, who will be interviewing, how will they identify themselves, will the interview be recorded, etc. So all those little details. So make sure you to put the interviewee at ease. Indicate what the level of privacy is for that interview. Is it in this case it's not going to be anonymous. You are looking at the person who's responding. There's no way to make it anonymous. You can make it private, but not anonymous. Confidential, that's another word you can use instead of privacy. Confidential, it can be confidential, and that's still a little difficult to achieve in an interview. Oftentimes, companies choose external people. If you are interviewed within your work space, you wouldn't be telling a coworker or a person that you see on a normal basis something that is a little bit more private in terms of opinion. That's why the company would bring somebody from the outside. Also explain whether people can opt in or out of the interview. If it's optional, usually an interview has to be optional. Has to be because otherwise we get into a whole dilemma of ethical issues, so we have to be careful with that. And also share what's the benefit for the respondent. What are they going to get out of it? Are we going to share the results with them? Are they going to see an increase in work environment, productivity, tools, etc.? Also describe if there are going to be any perks. Are they going to have breakfast? Are they going to be treated to a light snack? Are they going to have coffee? What's in it for me or the with them? And then thank them for their participation. Of course, we want to entice them to make sure they come. And then, of course, as you can see on the slide, the pilot, testing and revising. So it's ideal that once you have the questions for the interview, you test them with someone and you get to those questions of did it make sense, were you confused in terms of what I was asking, etc. Make the revisions necessary, send it again, and then conduct it. I do have on the slide conduct a survey, but I meant conduct the interview. So here are some examples of the interview questions. And obviously the ones in black are good. The ones in red, guess what? Not so good. So the first one, what do I believe is a normal workload? That's a good question because then the person is going to pour their heart out in terms of what they understand is good. And you want that. You want their perspective, right? You want the perspective of the interviewee. That's exactly why you are interviewing them. You also can ask things like, help me understand the challenges of the widget task or the recruiting task, etc. So that seems a little sophisticated and you may need to rephrase it a little bit, but essentially what you're saying is, what's your problem? What is the problem you're having with this task? You're just elegantly asking the question. So you have to also know your audience. You have to kind of get an idea what profile of audience you're going to be asking these questions to. Third question, do you experience any factors that affect customer interaction? Okay, again, a little sophisticated, but it doesn't matter to there's no benefit in dumbing down a question to the point where it sounds vernacular. So I'd say err always in good grammar, because what that is going to do is it's going to give validity to your research. So just because you want to align to the person that you want to interview doesn't mean you want to diminish the quality of the language you're using to ask the questions, because that takes formality out of the process. At the same time, you definitely don't want it confusing. If you have asked questions like this and you get to the third question and they still don't get what you're asking, Well, you're going to have to be an efficient interviewer and rephrase on the fly while staying on point. So, a bad example, so we have to be careful. How often do you see the ads for company X on TV? The problem with this question in an interview is you're asking people to recall information that they don't really have. And in an interview setting, you're asking for a quantitative measure that they may not have a good recollection of that. So at that point, I would say, do you want to spend the time getting that inaccurate data? Or would you prefer to send a quick survey of a couple of questions and get that data, where people have a little bit more time to recall? But in an interview, it's difficult to do that because you're looking at the person. If they don't answer, if they're trying to think about it, that creates silence. And you know what happens with silence. Some people cannot handle silence, so they will make up the answer. Another thing is, another example is, does it make you mad to see others not carry their workload? That is a bad question because we are already suggesting that they should be upset. And if that's the case, the quality of the answers are not going to be useful in any case. So at any rate, this is the ins and outs of the questions and some examples of the interviews around the qualitative data. So I hope this helps you, and there will be a couple of exercises we will do in class around the qualitative. But essentially, if you have practiced to ask questions for the survey, you won't have much of a problem creating questions for the interviews. And the last piece that I like to tell you is exactly what we covered just now. Now multiply it in the sense that now instead of solving for one person to meet one person, now you're going to have a group. So when we are talking about the protocol, think about simply saying you're going to participate in a focus group and then describe what the focus group is. Not everybody is walking around knowing what a focus group is, so we have to say that. And then another thing that is not on the slides, but it's something for you to keep in mind, is when you are going to conduct a focus group, you're going to need to set some boundaries, some rules of engagement. You're going to have to announce when it's adequate for somebody to interrupt, when it's okay for somebody to share their opinion while somebody else is speaking, or should they? And so that is a little bit more involved of a protocol because you're now saying how people are going to behave in sharing the responses in a group environment. And that is also good because then the interviewer, which is still potentially one person, won't lose handle of the entire group, especially if they have 8-10 people in a group. You cannot have one single person. Usually focus groups are conducted between 2 and 3 interviewers. One person is collecting the data, the other one is making the observations for the nonverbal, and then the other person is asking the questions and moderating the conversation and pausing and asking somebody to hold their opinion and let the other person finish, etc. So I hope this is helpful, and when you begin to do your research, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, you take these considerations into account, and you are successful gathering your data. All right, everyone, I'll talk to you soon.